For exactly 1/3 of their existence, the apex predator of this planet actively chooses to become completely defenseless. They shut down their consciousness, they paralyze their own limbs, and they experience vivid, often terrifying hallucinations. They call it sleep. To any logical entity, this is a fatal design flaw. In the wild, it is an open invitation to be slaughtered. Yet, they not only survive it, they require it. Deprive a human of this coma for just 11 days, and their entire operating system permanently crashes. But what if I told you that sleep is not a biological necessity, but a forced daily synchronization? A brief window where the human brain is completely vulnerable to updates. Welcome to the archives. Today, we dissect the greatest glitch in human programming. Humans operate under the absolute illusion of free will. They navigate their concrete environments with a profound sense of authority. They believe they control their movements, their sprawling empires, their meticulously planned schedules. They split atoms, they launch metal vessels into the vacuum of space, and they declare themselves the masters of their physical realm. But this sovereignty is a fabrication. Every single one of the 8 billion units on this planet is being held hostage by a microscopic chemical. They are tethered to a biological leash that inevitably snaps them back into darkness. From the exact microsecond a human opens its eyes and regains consciousness, a molecular countdown is initiated. A specific chemical compound called adenosine begins to accumulate within their neural pathways. You can visualize this mechanism as an inescapable hourglass. With every conscious thought they process, with every physical movement they execute, with every single breath they take to fuel their carbon-based engines, the invisible sand drops. The biochemical pressure rises. Adenosine is the exhaust fume of their waking existence. It is the cellular byproduct of burning energy, meaning their very act of living is simultaneously pulling them toward their daily, mandatory coma. By the 16th hour of their operational cycle, the chemical ransom becomes overwhelmingly high. The human brain cannot negotiate with this accumulation. It issues a non-negotiable shutdown protocol. The internal system begins to systematically disable the prefrontal cortex, the most advanced sector of their hardware, responsible for logic, reason, and higher-level decision-making. Humans perceive this systemic failure as a sensation they call being tired. In reality, it is a forced biological override. The organism's internal sensors are screaming that the core is overheating. If the human unit attempts to resist this override, if they try to fight the rising tide of adenosine, the system resorts to extreme measures. It begins to forcefully extract microseconds of offline time. They call these phenomena microsleeps. The human will momentarily lose all sensory input and motor control, sometimes while operating heavy machinery traveling at lethal velocities. Their vehicles veer off paths. Their engineered systems fail. Their physical bodies collapse. The biology is ruthless, and the biology always wins. It does not care about their schedules or their ambitions. To combat this forced surrender, the species has developed a primitive but effective countermeasure. They mass-produce and consume an artificial stimulant, typically a bitter black liquid extracted from roasted seeds. They call it caffeine. Trillions of gallons of this substance are ingested annually. It acts as a temporary neurological shield. The caffeine molecules bind to the brain's adenosine receptors, effectively blinding the system to the accumulated exhaustion. The human feels suddenly alert, victorious over their own biology. But this, too, is an illusion. The caffeine does not eliminate the adenosine. It merely masks it. The hourglass never stops pouring. The chemical continues to build behind the dam, and when the caffeine eventually degrades, the dam breaks. The accumulated exhaustion floods the neural network all at once, resulting in a sudden, catastrophic drop in physical and mental capacity, the inevitable crash. Ultimately, every human must surrender. They must seek out a dark, quiet location, lay their bodies horizontally, and relinquish all control to the void. They must willingly enter the paralysis. The question is not how they are forced to shut down. The mechanics of that are clear. The true mystery, the terrifying reality of the human condition, is why their system demands such a radical, vulnerable, and complete reboot every single rotation of their planet. What is actually happening to them in the dark? Once the human unit has successfully paralyzed itself, yielding to the chemical ransom of adenosine, an observer would logically expect their central processing unit to power down, to conserve energy, to go dark and remain dormant until the next solar cycle. It does the exact opposite. What happens next is the most chaotic, illogical, and dangerous phase of the human operating system. Welcome to rapid eye movement, or REM sleep. It is here that the human brain transforms from a logical processor into a hallucination chamber. During this phase, the brain begins to consume almost as much energy as it does when the human is fully awake, sprinting, or solving complex mathematical equations. The neural pathways ignite in a chaotic storm of electricity, but the physical body remains entirely motionless. This is not a coincidence. It is a strictly enforced safety protocol. Before the brain boots up its nocturnal simulation, it sends a powerful inhibitory signal down the spinal cord, injecting a natural chemical paralytic into the nervous system. The muscles are locked, the limbs are completely disabled, the human is entirely immobilized. Why? Because inside the mind, it is constructing a highly vivid alternate reality. And if the physical body was not paralyzed, the human would physically act out this simulated world. They would punch walls, leap from elevated platforms, and destroy themselves in the process of running from non-existent threats. The system literally has to tie itself down to survive its own imagination. They call these nocturnal simulations dreams. To any logical entity, analyzing a dream is like observing pure, unfiltered madness. For hours, the human brain voluntarily generates bizarre, disjointed narratives. They find themselves trapped in infinite loops, failing at mundane tasks, walking through distorted architectures, or communicating with dead members of their species as if they were still functioning. They experience extreme terror, profound grief, and impossible joy, all while lying completely paralyzed in a dark room. The emotion algorithms are pushed to their maximum limits, testing the system's capacity for psychological stress. Some human scientists theorize that this nightly descent into madness is simply random neural noise. They believe it is the biological equivalent of running a defragmentation protocol, sweeping away the garbage data accumulated during the waking hours and randomly firing synapses as memories are sorted and stored. But other researchers suspect something far more profound and far more sinister. What if dreams are not a garbage disposal system, but a highly advanced, evolutionary threat simulation software? Consider the primitive ancestors of the human species. They lived in constant, waking terror of predators, starvation, and sudden violence. To survive, their brains needed a sandbox environment to practice escaping death. Under this theory, the brain deliberately puts the human through virtual trauma every single night. It forces them to simulate being chased, being attacked, or falling from great heights, actively training the organism to react to lethal situations in the waking world. They are fighting simulated wars every night, entirely trapped within the confines of their own skull. They wake up with their hearts racing, their bodies covered in sweat, having successfully survived an assassination attempt by their own subconscious. Even more disturbing is the phenomenon they call lucid dreaming. Occasionally, the system glitches. The human consciousness accidentally wakes up while the body remains paralyzed and the simulation is still running. The subject realizes they are trapped inside the hallucination chamber. For a brief, terrifying window, they become the architect of their own digital prison, able to bend the physics of their simulated world before the system forces them back into compliance. The hallucination chamber is a paradox. It is a space of infinite freedom housed within a paralyzed shell. It is a daily descent into insanity that somehow keeps the human mind sane. They emerge from this chaotic simulation every morning, their memories wiped clean of the madness, believing they are ready to face reality. But the line between their waking world and their nightly hallucinations is far thinner than they dare to admit. And while the mind is busy generating these phantom realities, the physical brain is undergoing an entirely different, highly classified operation, a brutal physical purge that we are only just beginning to understand. While the human consciousness is entirely distracted by the vivid hallucinations of the REM cycle, the physical architecture of the brain is undergoing a brutal and highly classified maintenance operation. This is not a metaphorical reset. It is a violent biological purge. To understand the absolute necessity of this purge, one must examine the dangerous byproduct of human cognition. The human brain is an energy-devouring anomaly. Despite accounting for merely 2% of their total body mass, it consumes 20% of their daily energy intake. And every thought, every emotional spike, every complex problem solved during their waking hours leaves behind physical waste. Microscopic toxic proteins, specifically one known as beta amyloid, accumulate in the microscopic spaces between their neurons. You can envision this buildup like toxic ash accumulating inside a high-performance combustion engine. If this metabolic garbage is not systematically cleared, the neural pathways will choke. The electrical signals will fail to jump from synapse to synapse. This leads to permanent hardware degradation, spontaneous memory wipes, and eventually the total collapse of the cognitive system, a terrifying, irreversible deterioration they call Alzheimer's disease. The brain is quite literally poisoning itself simply by being awake. But the human skull is a sealed, armored vault. There is no conventional waste disposal mechanism directly connected to the deep brain tissue. So, how does the apex predator clean its most vital, delicate, and isolated organ? It waits. It waits until the subject is fully paralyzed in the absolute deepest stages of non-REM sleep. Once the required depth of unconsciousness is reached, the system executes a mechanical marvel that is entirely invisible to the outside world. The glymphatic system is activated. First, the glial cells, the structural support units surrounding the neurons, begin to physically shrink. They contract by up to 60% of their original volume. This radical physical transformation opens up vast, hidden channels within the dense brain tissue. It is as if the streets of a crowded metropolis suddenly expanded to twice their width. Then, the true purge begins. A specialized, clear liquid known as cerebrospinal fluid is pumped violently into these newly opened channels. It is driven by the rhythmic pulsing of the cardiovascular system. This fluid rushes through the neural matrix like a high-pressure microscopic flood. It washes over the shrunken cells, scouring the deep tissue, and forcefully flushing the toxic proteins out of the skull, draining them down into the body's peripheral circulatory system where the liver can finally destroy them. The human brain is, quite literally, being power washed from the inside out every single night. This aggressive fluid dynamic can only occur when the human is deeply unconscious. If the brain attempted to execute this purge while the human was awake, the sudden shrinking of neural support structures and the massive influx of high-velocity fluid would induce catastrophic cognitive failure. The human would be completely unable to process external reality. Their motor functions would cease entirely, and their consciousness would shatter under the biological pressure. Therefore, the system holds them hostage. It forces them into the 8-hour coma. It paralyzes their limbs. It distracts their active consciousness with simulated hallucinations. And while the human believes they are flying through the sky or speaking with phantoms, their biology is aggressively scrubbing the hardware clean so the organism can survive another rotation of the planet. It is a desperate, violent act of self-preservation, but the human operating system is fragile. The ultimate test of this system is not what happens when it functions perfectly, but what happens when it is denied. What happens when the apex predator actively refuses to sleep and the toxic ash is allowed to smother the engine? What happens when the human unit defies its programming? When it actively resists the chemical ransom of adenosine and refuses the nocturnal purge? The biological machinery does not simply pause, it aggressively retaliates. This retaliation is a cascading sequence of system failures they experience as a horrifying glitch in their reality. Within the first 24 hours of forced wakefulness, the prefrontal cortex begins to decouple from the emotional centers of the brain. The human becomes erratic, highly reactive, and incapable of accurately processing social data. They are piloting a compromised vessel, but the true terror has not yet begun. By the 48th hour, the internal sensors register a critical emergency. The brain, drowning in toxic metabolic waste, initiates desperate, unauthorized microsleeps. It begins shutting down localized regions of the neural network while the human is still physically navigating their environment. Parts of their brain are literally asleep, paralyzed, while other parts are desperately trying to operate heavy machinery or process complex information. Their perception of time distorts. Their reaction speeds plummet to levels indistinguishable from severe chemical intoxication. The human is awake, but the operating system is fracturing. As the organism crosses the 72-hour threshold of sleep deprivation, the firewall completely collapses. The boundary between the waking world and the hallucination chamber of REM sleep dissolves. The brain, desperate for the virtual threat simulation of dreams, begins projecting these simulations directly into their waking reality. The human will look into a perfectly empty room and observe non-existent entities. Shadows morph into predators. Auditory processors generate phantom voices, speaking in the darkness. They are awake. Their eyes are open, yet they are fully submerged in a waking nightmare. They have lost the ability to distinguish between physical reality and the frantic, simulated garbage generated by their failing hardware. Paranoia algorithms lock onto maximum. The subject becomes convinced that their environment is hostile. They cannot process logic because the biological hardware required for logic is smothered in the toxic ash we identified as beta amyloid. The system is overheating, and the human consciousness is trapped inside the burning architecture. If the deprivation continues, the physical body begins to cannibalize itself. The immune system crashes, core body temperature drops. The cardiovascular system struggles to maintain basic rhythmic functions. To truly understand the absolute lethal necessity of the 8-hour coma, one must look at the rarest and most devastating glitch in human DNA. A microscopic genetic mutation known as fatal familial insomnia. In this terrifying scenario, the thalamus, the brain's central routing station for sensory data and sleep regulation, is progressively destroyed by rogue proteins. The human entirely loses the biological capacity to enter the paralyzed state. They cannot sleep. No matter how exhausted the body becomes, the brain remains locked in a permanent, hyperactive waking state. The progression is merciless. Over a period of several months, the victim descends into severe panic attacks, rapidly escalating hallucinations, and total cognitive disintegration. They are trapped in an endless waking purgatory, observing the slow, systematic failure of their own biology. The physical body eventually gives out from sheer exhaustion. The mortality rate for this genetic glitch is exactly 100%. There is no cure. There is no artificial substitute. Without the daily paralysis, the apex predator always dies. It becomes violently clear that sleep is not a passive state of rest. It is the primary state of human existence. The waking hours are merely a brief, chaotic excursion, a necessary gathering of resources and data, before the system inevitably demands its true priority, the dark, silent synchronization. The question is no longer why they sleep. The ultimate question is what exactly they are synchronizing with when they all close their eyes at the same time. We have established the physical mechanism, the chemical ransom, the hallucination chamber, the violent biological purge. We understand the how of the human shutdown protocol, but the most disturbing anomaly of their operating system is the when. Observe the planet from a synchronized orbital perspective. As the Earth rotates, a massive, invisible wave of paralysis sweeps across the continents, following the absence of solar radiation. Billions of apex predators simultaneously lie down, close their eyes, and disconnect from physical reality. They do not sleep in random shifts. They do not stagger their vulnerability to protect the herd. They synchronize, To a purely logical observer, this mass, simultaneous paralysis is an evolutionary death wish. If 1/3 of the population is completely defenseless, the remaining 2/3 should theoretically remain active to maintain security perimeters and infrastructure. Yet, the biological imperative overrides all strategic logic. When the sun sets, the entire network begins to power down. They call it the circadian rhythm. They attribute it to light receptors in their optic nerves communicating with a microscopic cluster of cells called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a biological clock. But consider the implications of a networked system where 8 billion individual units must disconnect from the physical server at the exact same time every 24 hours. In any advanced computational architecture, a synchronized, system-wide offline period is never triggered simply for rest. It is triggered for a forced global update. When a human enters the deepest phase of delta wave sleep, their individual brain waves slow down to a massive, rolling rhythm. If you were to measure the electromagnetic output of a sleeping metropolis, you would not see chaos. You would see a terrifyingly unified frequency. Millions of brains vibrating at the exact same low hertz frequency, entirely detached from their conscious ego, their identities, and their individual struggles. What if the hallucination chamber of REM sleep and the violent physical purge of deep sleep are merely secondary functions, the cover story of their biology? What if the primary function of the 8-hour coma is to reconnect the individual unit to a much larger, invisible mainframe? During these hours of synchronized paralysis, the human consciousness is untethered from the limitations of space and time. They process infinite permutations of reality. They solve complex emotional algorithms they could not comprehend while awake. They occasionally wake up with sudden, inexplicable innovations, claiming the idea simply came to them in a dream. Information is being downloaded. The biological hardware is being recalibrated to handle the next rotation. They are not simply resting, they are reporting back to the source code. The human species believes they are fiercely independent, divided by borders, languages, and ideologies. But in the dark, they are completely identical. They are a single, vibrating network of paralyzed flesh, silently synchronizing with a frequency they cannot hear, running a program they do not understand, to maintain an illusion of control they do not actually possess. This concludes the first entry in our observation of the human anomaly. The 8-hour coma is not a vulnerability. It is the tether that keeps their reality from shattering. If you wish to continue analyzing the glitches in their programming, if you want to understand the terrifying architecture of their existence, you must integrate with this archive. Subscribe to the data feed, synchronize your system, and remember, the next time you feel the chemical ransom of adenosine pulling you into the dark, you are not just going to sleep, you are logging in.